Steve Jackson Games, the makers of GURPS, have recently asked for feedback on what we would like to see in a 5th edition of GURPS. So in this video, I'm going to endeavor to answer just that question. So what are the problems, the pain points in GURPS that really need to be fixed and addressed? Well, first off, it's really hard to find a game, okay? It's easier to create a group of people or get a group together and teach them GURPS than it is to go out and find a GURPS game. And I've had that problem in places like Chicago, really large cities and what have you, where I could find a game, but there was literally 1 or 2 listed, okay? It's incredibly hard to find a GURPS game. Second, it's too complicated. And I have talked about this at length in my review video of GURPS. You can go check that out if you want to hear my full opinion on it. But by and large, the wider community as a whole and TTRPGs consider GURPS to be too complicated. You can disagree with that all you want, but the community really has a consensus on that. They feel like GURPS is too complicated. Or as one commenter on that video actually said, and I'll just read what they had to say, the amount of work necessary to make a consistent and easily communicated game and setting using GURPS comes close to creating your own game completely from scratch. And that's absolutely true. I think they got it spot on here. And that goes into my last point, which is it feels like you need a PhD in GURPS to be able to homebrew or be able to make your own world in GURPS. And what I mean by that is just understanding the breadth of GURPS, you know, everything that it might entail that you might want to put in a various system takes an incredible amount of reading and effort to understand the breadth of what you need. And then to decide, okay, from that huge breadth that you have, what are you going to choose? This is basically the toolbox problem that I explained before, except for it's not really a toolbox. Playing GURPS is like walking into a professional machine shop with wood shop and everything else all in one. And you have in various places around the shop examples of what you can do. So you have examples of what you can make with a programmable lathe. You have examples of what you can 3D print out of metal or some other material. You have all these crazy things you can do with the GURPS systems, but it's just a giant shop and you have to figure out, okay, now you make something that you want to make. And it's overwhelming to most people. Okay, so we define the problem. Well, what do we need? Well, what we really need, first off, is modularity out of the box. We need settings, genres, and worlds that are predetermined out of the box and have everything contained. And what I mean by that, because I know a lot of you are going to be like, oh, GURPS has that, is that we don't need references back to the basic set. The basic set in GURPS 4e is amazing. It is that huge machine shop that has everything you need. But whenever you pick up a lot of the additional books, you find that most of them just reference the first book. And it's really not that easy for most people. What we need is something that is self-contained that says, hey, you want to play GURPS high fantasy? Here you go. Here's the book. Here's everything you need. It's all in one place. GURPS Fantasy does not do that, at least not well enough. Take this and apply it to settings and worlds and you're on the right track. Part of what I mean by this too is better character templates. Yes, having a condensed list of, you know, here's what a wizard looks like, here's what a warrior looks like is okay. But what people really need, they need more handholding than that. They need more explanation of what it means to be a wizard in GURPS, to be a warrior in GURPS. And clearly these setting and genre specific books are not doing the trick. In other words, all of these books need to be self-contained and not simply references to specific uses of things that are more generally explained in the basic set that you can then recreate. That is too much work for most people. These kind of genre-specific books, what they really need to fulfill is that issue for GMs who can pick and choose. They need to have an easy way to communicate to your players what is allowed in your world and what is not allowed. Okay, right now it is way too much. It is impossible. Yes, there are some strange and alien-like abilities that you want in your traditional fantasy, and there are some that absolutely don't belong in there. And right now, the piecemeal way that you have to go through at every single ability, like, oh yes, that's allowed. Oh no, that's not allowed. There's not an easy way for the GM communicate to their players. It takes entirely too much work for them to do that. I think genre-specific books would be one great way of doing that, but there are actually quite a few of other ways that would also work as well. Another thing that a 5th edition of GURPS really needs is better balance. Right now, if you take a handful of points that equal some large amount, and then you compare it to one ability that is worth that same amount of points, these things often do not balance out. I know this is an incredibly difficult task, but something needs to be done. And whenever you take certain abilities from some of the expanded books, such as the Sonic's Handbook, and compare that to what you can do with magic, things do not equal out. Nor does the idea of a TK bullet belong in a fantasy setting. And there's no clear way of understanding or explaining that to players or to GMs so that they actually know that, okay? Instead, the GM has to make rulings about every single thing, what they're going to allow, what they're not going to allow, and it's just entirely too much for 99.9% of GMs out there. There needs to be some, again, that modularity out of the box, but also the balance that goes with it so that you can clearly explain to your players like, hey, here's what's allowed, here's what's not allowed, here's the power level, and here's how we're going to adhere to that. And this is coming from someone who has homebrewed the hell out of GURPS, okay? I feel like I have a PhD in GURPS, and what I mean by that is by having a PhD in GURPS, I finally realize how little I know about the system after having played it for decades, okay? There is so much more to it. There are so many more people that know more than I do, but now I have a good grasp on what that is. And I think in a lot of ways, those who have gotten PhDs in technical fields, that you might actually feel that same way. At least a lot of my friends do. And just for an example, we don't even play with 3d6 anymore. We've tried out 2d10, we've tried out 1d20, we've tried out other things. We've stuck with 2d10. That's what we decided we were going to go with. So we don't even play with the standard dice that you would play with within GURPS. That's how much we've customized the system, and all the other stuff that you can imagine goes along with that. So this is not from someone who doesn't understand GURPS. Another thing that we need in GURPS, and this is going to be controversial, is we need better realism. And and a lot of people are going to be like, GURPS is the most realistic, the most simulator type system out there in the market, and I would absolutely agree. Here's the problem. Some of those systems were clearly designed by nerds, and what I mean by that are people that are not particularly athletic, okay? And I know that Crom and others went out and they clearly looked at what is physically possible, and they try to model that off GURPS. And on a lot of things, they got that dead right. They got it really right. On other things, such as archery, they got it dead wrong, okay? Archery in GURPS typically takes 3 rounds. You've got to draw your arrow, you've got to knock it, and then you can release. In real life, you can go watch a YouTube video of a 16-year-old kid, 14-year-old kid who can shoot more than 1 arrow a second. Yes, it's a light draw bow. Yes, they're taking shorter shots, but here's the deal. That's a child. If you can imagine what a professional athlete could do if they were entirely trained to do this one thing, because that's essentially what most traditional adventurers are. You could see that, you know what, you could have a heavy draw bow, especially if they're particularly strong. You could easily shoot 1 arrow a second if you are practicing that. So an elf in the woods should be able to shoot 1 arrow a second. These things are very much not balanced or realistic. And I think there's more things like that in GURPS, more than the hardcore fans would probably like to admit. So I think some rebalancing around that would really be helpful. And again, if you don't believe me, go check out Lars Anderson, go check out some of these other people on YouTube and see what the human body is really capable of. Also, I would point out, as someone who's lifted weights their entire life, that some of the lifting rules don't seem to quite match. They're not horrible, they're not bad, but they don't also quite line up exactly as I think they really should. And then the last thing, and honestly probably one of the most important things, it needs IP and it needs promotion. I think some third party to be able to create realistic worlds using the GURPS rules that are all self-contained in one book would be hugely popular, and I think it'd be very helpful for GURPS in general. Third-party content is the reason that D&D is what it is today, and I think that it really is what most people want moving forward. I know that, Steve Jackson Games seems to be very protective of their IP, and I absolutely do not blame them, but I think there is some middle ground here where there could be more third-party content made specifically for GURPS. Or in lieu of that, there needs to be more content produced of a higher quality and more specific, like what I'm talking about, where it's out of the box coming from GURPS. And again, I know that there's a lot of hardcore GURPS fans that are going to tell me those things exist, and what I'm telling you is that the market, the community, has clearly said that that's not good enough. What is currently out there is clearly not good enough. Even if it's good enough for you and me, it's not good enough for the average player. And then along with that, I would love to grab George R.R. Martin, he plays GURPS, grab Thomas Middleditch, let's make a movie. We've seen with things like Stranger Things, Critical Role, and what have you, that Dimension 20 and everything else, these are the kind of things that really drive people to an audience to a game, okay? Because you can have the best game in the world, but if nobody knows about it, it doesn't really matter. And then when they do know about it, it needs to be accessible. And those are the things that we really need to fix. And this will solve those problems that I mentioned at the beginning. It'll solve where it's easier to find a game because there'll be more people finding a game, and it'll be easier to get into a game. It'll solve the issue where, it feeling too complicated for most people. We all know hardcore GURPS fans, you can simplify GURPS really, to a fairly basic level. but being able to simplify it kind of takes a PhD in GURPS to figure out what rules are you going to take. We really need some modularity that like, hey, here's the light version of the system with all the things you need, with all the flavor and everything else you need, and you can purchase this. Now, what I think this leads to is that you're going to need to purchase a lot more books. Now, for me, that's not really a big deal. Probably not for you either, because we probably already have stacks on our bookshelf of GURPS books, in addition to all the PDFs that we bought separately. I switched over PDFs a long time ago, but I've got a stack of books longer than I can show you on screen of GURPS books. So I get that, okay? But what we need is those fully integrated, hey, here's the fantasy book. It's thick, but it has everything you need to play Dungeons and Dragons like fantasy settings, but with GURPS. Here's another one that you need, and it's everything you need for sci-fi or cyberpunk. And there needs to be some modularity to that so it's very easy for people, and also various levels of difficulty, okay? Here's the basic level. Here's the next level up. Here's the uber complicated for those of us who are super sweaty and have our PhD in GURPS. Anyways, if you agree, disagree, and you want to hear what else I have to say about GURPS, I actually did a full review, and I'll link the video here. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.